October 7, 1854. North Beach, San Francisco. Sunrise. A dock worker named Patrick Doyle walks out onto Meiggs Wharf to start his shift. The wharf is 2,000 feet of timber pushing into the bay, the longest in the city. He knows every ship that should be tied to it. This morning, one of them is missing. The bark American, chartered 3 days earlier by a private party, is gone from its mooring. The ropes have been cut, not untied. They lie in coils on the planks, the cut ends still wet from the bay. Near the cleat where the American had been tied, Doyle finds something strange. A leather strap, the kind used to secure a piano crate for shipping. The buckle is still fastened. The crate is gone. Doyle does not know it yet, but the man who owned that piano had been, the night before, the most trusted merchant in San Francisco. By noon, he will be the most hunted. You were taught that the gold rush ended because the gold ran out. That is not what happened. In 1854, California was still pulling roughly $70 million in gold a year out of its rivers and hills. The metal was there. The men were there. The boats were still arriving in the bay every week. What collapsed was something else. Something the history books don't put in the chapter on the gold rush, because it does not fit the story of pickaxes and panning. It fits a different story. A story you have probably already lived through, in your own time, more than once. Here is what the history books leave out. The gold rush did not die because the gold ran out. The gold rush died because the paper ran out first. And to understand what that means, you have to start with one man. His name was Henry Meiggs. He was born in Catskill, New York, in 1811. By 1849, he was 38 years old, broke, and living in Brooklyn with a wife and 4 children. When the news from California reached the East Coast, he did what thousands of other men did. He scraped together everything he had, and he booked passage west. But Meiggs did not go to dig. Meiggs went to sell. He arrived in San Francisco aboard the Albany in the summer of 1849, carrying a cargo of New England lumber. In Brooklyn, that lumber had been worth a few $1,000s. In San Francisco, where every tent in the city was being replaced with wood, where the price of a single board had risen 10 times in 18 months, Meiggs sold it for a fortune. He understood something most of the men around him did not. The men with the picks were not getting rich. The men selling shovels to the men with the picks were getting rich. He built a sawmill at North Beach. He bought land. He bought more land. By 1853, he had built Meiggs Wharf, 2,000 feet of timber pushing into the bay, the longest wharf in the city. He had been elected alderman of the 3rd Ward. He had a brother, John Meiggs, who held the office of city comptroller. The two of them, together, controlled the lumber trade and the city's books. The Annals of San Francisco, written that same year, described Henry Meiggs as a man of, quote, the most unblemished reputation. He lived in a house on Broadway with a piano in the parlor. He had 4 children and a 5th on the way. When he walked through the city, men tipped their hats. This was the world he was operating in. In 1847, 2 years before the gold rush, a lot at the corner of Montgomery and Jackson Streets sold for $16. By 1853, that same lot sold for $45,000. $45,000. In 1853 money. Nobody asked how. Nobody had to. The gold was coming out of the ground. The ships were coming into the bay. The numbers were going up. Everybody who held land held more wealth this month than last month. And everybody who held paper claims on land held more wealth still. And then, In late 1853, the gold began to slow. California gold production had peaked in 1852 at $81 million. By 1854, it was already falling. Not by much, not enough that the men in the saloons noticed, but enough that the men in the banking houses did. Henry Meiggs was leveraged on real estate. He had bought lots on credit, built on them on credit, and borrowed against them on credit. When the values stopped rising, the math began to come apart. So he made a decision. He began to forge. The instrument he used was the city warrant. A city warrant, in 1853 San Francisco, was a piece of paper signed by the alderman and countersigned by the comptroller, promising to pay a specified sum from the city treasury. They were treated, in the banking houses of San Francisco, almost as good as gold. Henry Meiggs was an alderman. His brother John was the comptroller. Between them, they could sign a warrant into existence. So they did. Not one, not 10. They forged warrants for the better part of a year. They sold them into the banks. They used the proceeds to cover Meiggs's debts, to buy more land, to keep the operation moving. The warrants went into bank vaults. They were used as collateral for further loans. They were exchanged hand to hand among the wealthiest men in the city. By the autumn of 1854, the total value of the forged paper had reached approximately $800,000. In today's money, close to $30 million. And nobody knew. The official story says Henry Meiggs was a respected city father in the autumn of 1854. The truth is something else. The truth is that by October of that year, Meiggs knew the warrants were going to be examined. A new city audit had been called. He had perhaps weeks, perhaps days. On October 3rd, 1854, he chartered a bark called the American, under a false story about a lumber expedition to Tahiti. On the night of October 6th, he loaded it. He brought his wife. He brought all 4 of his children. He brought his brother John, the city comptroller, and John's family. He brought, by witness account, his piano. The loading was done in the dark. Workers on the wharf the next morning would say only that it had been done, quote, in great haste. At some point in the early hours of October 7th, the ropes were cut. The American slipped its mooring and rode out of San Francisco Bay on the ebb tide. By the time the sun came up over Meiggs Wharf, Henry Meiggs and $800,000 in forged paper were already at sea. San Francisco woke up the next day still rich. It would not stay that way for long. The discovery of the forgery was not immediate. The warrants were spread across half a dozen banking houses. The audit took weeks. Through the winter of 1854 and into early 1855, the city held its breath, then began to whisper, then began to shout. The first banking house to break was Page, Bacon & Co., February 17, 1855. A run on the bank. The doors closed at noon. The notice posted. Payments suspended. Within 72 hours, Adams & Co., the largest express and banking firm on the West Coast, had suspended. Wells Fargo suspended for 3 days. Robinson & Co. suspended. By the end of February, the daily Alta California was publishing daily lists of the failed. The lists kept coming. Over 200 San Francisco businesses collapsed between February and April of 1855. The lot at Montgomery and Jackson Streets, which had sold for $45,000 in 1853, was offered for $8,000 in the summer of 1855, and found no buyer. A creditor, quoted in the Daily Alta California that October, said only this: "We are all of us ruined together." And the human detail, the detail the textbooks skip. Men who had been millionaires on paper, men who had walked the streets of San Francisco in tailored coats 6 months earlier, were seen at the docks selling their pocket watches for steerage passage out of the city. The Alta reported suicides through the spring. Real estate offices closed and were not reopened. Storefronts on Montgomery Street stood vacant through the summer. This is what ended the gold rush. Not the exhaustion of the gold, the exhaustion of the trust. The gold kept flowing for another decade. California would produce gold into the 1860s, into the 1870s, into the 20th century. But the boom, the speculative, paper-fueled, everybody-getting-richer boom of 1849 to 1854, that boom died on the morning of February 17th, 1855, when the doors of Page, Bacon & Co. closed at noon. Henry Meiggs, by then, was already in Chile. He did not stay in Chile. By 1858, Henry Meiggs had moved to Peru, where he convinced the Peruvian government to hire him to build a railroad. Not just any railroad, the Ferrocarril Central Andino, a railroad through the Andes Mountains, climbing to over 15,000 feet, the highest standard-gauge railroad in the world at the time it was built. He completed it. He became, in Peru, what he had been in San Francisco: wealthy, respected, a man of, quote, the most unblemished reputation. In 1873, the California state legislature, desperate to recover something from the wreckage, passed a special act. It pardoned Henry Meiggs for the warrant forgery, on the condition that he return to California and pay his creditors. He sent his regrets. He died in Lima, Peru, on September 30th, 1877. He was 66 years old. He had never been extradited. He had never stood trial. By the time of his death, he was wealthier than he had been on the night he loaded the American. His creditors in San Francisco received nothing. This is the part the textbooks do not put in the chapter on the gold rush. The gold rush, the way it actually ended, was not a story about gold. It was a story about a piece of paper signed by two brothers, and what happens to a city when that piece of paper turns out to be a lie. Every speculative boom in American history has had its Henry Meiggs. The names change, the paper changes, the boats change. The pattern does not. Return to the wharf. October 7, 1854. First light. Patrick Doyle is still standing on Meiggs Wharf, looking at the empty mooring. The ropes are still in coils on the planks. The cut ends are still wet from the bay, and the leather strap from the piano crate, with the buckle still fastened, lies where it was dropped in the dark.